Imran, I'm really appreciative of you taking the time to have a chat with me today about some of the questions that I have about how to run a board meeting, as I'm doing it for the first time for OxPal, as you know, which helps medical students in Palestine and doctors in Palestine to teach them, but also generate initiatives on the ground, generate research activity. I have a series of questions that I wanted to go through.
Yeah, all I want to say was I think the work that you guys are doing is really impactful. I think it's a great use case of technology in healthcare. So it's great to talk about it. I'll share my thoughts. There's a medical education charity I was involved in based in London for a few years called the International Medical Education Trust, where I was on the board. And then more recently, two startups, one in the medical education space called Medicine Africa, which does similar work in Somaliland, and then also a health tech startup called My Health. So happy to share what I've learned.
No, that's great. That's why the man for the job. So my first question, I sort of divided it into before the meeting, and after the meeting. So before the meeting, when one wants to set an agenda for a board meeting, which is what I'm currently trying to do, I've put my own ideas down on paper. Do I do it alone? Do I do it sort of just with the directors who I've already been talking to? Or do I also go around the other board members and ask, sort of iterate the agenda? Or is it sort of you and the board on what needs to be spoken about? I guess that also ties into the second question, which is what sorts of things should be on the agenda? But just the first bit is, how do you construct an agenda?
It's a good question. And it's also a really good place to start. So the simple answer from my point of view here is that the board meetings are not to update people. They're there principally to discuss important strategic matters that are forward-looking. It's talking about the future. So the agenda should reflect that. And as an example, typically I would have a fixed template for the agenda. So there would often be a piece at the beginning where there might be like a little update, like a little narrative summary, and perhaps just some alignment on some key numbers. That helps people to calibrate on where the organization is. But really you want to shift gears and take the agenda into topics that are forward-looking, the biggest topics that are on your mind. And 2 to 3 are a good number. If you start to have more than that, then either you need a really long meeting or you don't have enough time for each one. You really want 30 to 45 minutes to kind of get into a topic. So when you're setting the agenda, I would start with that template. So just to recap that, I would start with some standing, very high level summary. And we can talk a bit more in a moment around how you send pre-reads. Sometimes you know that some of your board members have specific areas that they're concerned about or like interested in. That might have come up in a previous board meeting. It might have come up in your more informal interactions with them. That's one input of what you should be discussing. But the main input is actually you and your team, your executive team. What are you facing? What are you struggling with? What are you thinking about in the future where you need some external input? I think you need to think about how you're setting expectations for board members and what being a board member looks like. So that starts at the very beginning of recruitment of board members. And obviously you have some that are onboarded now, but the expectation setting is really important, and professionalizing that a little bit with clear expectations in terms of what you will do to make life easy for them. So for example, making sure you send material out 7 to 10 days in advance, giving them a chance to ask questions. One way you can do that, say, is you send a pre-read. Some people actually have seen this done as videos. So they'll just use like QuickTime or Loom and they'll do a screen capture and they'll just walk through the pre-read, or it's just a memo or some slides. And you basically say, if you have any questions on this, you can link them in this Google Doc. The nice thing about Google Doc is people can just dip in and out. And then as you reply to those, that becomes like a dynamic resource for other board members. So ahead of the meeting, you can have that, start having that interaction. You can also say, we expect you to have engaged with the material so that we can use the time for more useful stuff rather than doing the update. Because if you turn up and people are basically asking questions, you're just not really using the time that usefully in terms of having everybody together on the line. And if you can have template documents, template emails, and be a bit ahead of the game in terms of planning, so that 2 to 3 weeks before the board meeting, you start thinking about those materials, and then 7 to 10 days, they're ready to go out. And then people know to submit questions up to 2 days before the meeting, then you can answer them. Then you have the meeting, and then you know that you need to follow up, and we can come to that a bit later. I would try and set that sort of cadence, lay it out. You'll have people that are helping you prepare that, sort of work backwards a bit like a launch.
You've also covered the other questions I had about the pre-preparation and what to focus on the agenda. How large do you think a board should reasonably be? I think I read in Peter Thiel's book that he said 3 to 5 people.
Yeah, I think that's sensible. I have been in a situation where a company has had more board members than employees, and that was a bit weird. They tend to get bigger as the companies are bigger and has more stakeholders. But yeah, 3 to 5, I think, is a good number.
Okay, that's really useful as well. Then, where does accountability fit into the board process? If, for example, the next directors who take over who have not yet been decided, and I'm sure they'll be great, but if they weren't quite getting the job done, or it wasn't going as well as planned, or they tried something that wasn't working, does accountability feature into board meetings, or is it a separate process that happens outside of that context?
Usually for a company, the bylaws will establish that the board is there to be like a check and a balance on the executive leadership. So they are a source of accountability for the executive team, the CEO and the other leaders of the team. In some cases, actually, boards have the power to remove some of the executive team members. You need to take that quite seriously. Having said that, the board are not there to run the company. The vast majority of issues that company faces don't make it up to board level or even beyond that to investors. Most of them are actually done at the executive team, and the chief executive is the key person to make this decision. So the chief exec is running the company. The board is a source of accountability that sometimes can have real power to remove or replace a chief executive and also replace other board members like a chair. That tends to be where the balance is struck in the dance between the executive team that are updating on the results and presenting the plans and getting those approved, and then the board who are there to make sure that exercise happens and happens well.
That's really good to know. Hopefully that situation does not arise, but if it does in future,
yeah.
I'll ask you a bit more of the details on it. What is expected of them in the meeting? What sorts of things am I hoping that they're going to contribute? Because then that again can inform who else we recruit to the board. So
I think onboarding is actually a great idea. The vast majority, I think, of companies probably don't do any structured onboarding. Depending on how much time you have or how extensive the onboarding is, you might just choose to do that one-on-one. You pick up the phone, you have an initial conversation, but it's always good to have some stuff written down. These days, there are loads of tools I mentioned before. I think that's a really good idea. And having that as a standard set of things where, over time you're adding to it, because you always have ideas. Sometimes you don't know where to put them. You have an idea in a board meeting, but gosh, somebody on the meeting has had a misunderstanding about what we're here for or what their commitment needs to be. That really should have been in the onboarding documents. And sending it to people in a way where they can digest it and just getting them to acknowledge that, I think, is really important. You may also have legal documents. You may have board members that are signing agreements, formal or informal commitments, and your management of the board in terms of sharing material ahead of time. Those are important commitments for a board member, because you don't set them up for success if you don't commit to give them enough time, or you commit and you don't follow through and you just send them stuff the night before. That's really important.
Now I've set their expectations, they're up to date, we get there, we're sort of at the meeting. How do I sort of organize that meeting process? Obviously, we've got the agenda. What sort of tips or thoughts have you got on how to make that discussion as productive as possible?
Going back to the structure of the meeting, the agenda, I would have that as a template so that every time you have a meeting, you have muscle memory. You know that there's an initial bit at the beginning where you do a narrative summary of the pre-read. You reinforce some of the key numbers to calibrate people in the right ballpark of what the organization is doing. And then you go into the strategic areas. So this is the meat of the conversation. This is the bulk of what people are there to discuss. Again, 2 or 3 of them, and having a time boxing around them. So I would say you want 30 to 45 minutes on each of those. So the first part in total can be 20 minutes. Maybe there's 10 to 15 minutes of people just chatting, 10 to 15 minutes of that initial update. And then the strategic topics are 30 to 45 minutes each. And the way that you keep people to time there, if there's a chair of the meeting or chair of the board, a key part of that role is actually keeping the conversation to time. So with the agenda, make sure you've got timings, make sure you've got actual allocated sections there. And let's say that you have a section. I'm just going to give a kind of dummy example, which is that you want to launch your service in a new country. Yeah, that's one of the key strategic discussion points. So you might say you've got 45 minutes for this. Then on the agenda, if there are sub points of that decision, we've narrowed down 3 markets or 3 countries, and we want to have a look at them from a few different points of view. And we want to get your input. One is, what's the business environment there like? Is it conducive for international organizations to come in and launch? The second is the political situation. What do we know about that? And is there any way that we can ease our entry into the market? There might be a third one, competitive environment in the markets. So these points you can put in the agenda and they steer the discussion. They become the specific discussion points. And you can also, knowing what you know about your board members, in advance of the meeting, you can steer board members in their preparation towards specific points. So let's say you've got somebody with a legal background, or you've got somebody with lots of local connections. You can say, can you pay particular attention to this question when we get here? I would like to hear your thoughts on who we should be connecting with on the ground. So I think that's a way to set yourself up for success. And then your job there in the conversation is to try and elicit as much input as possible. Sometimes you'll find where there are decisions to be made, being very clear about what the decision is. So let's say the conversation is about picking a market. So the decision is we need to pick one. And then sharing as much as you can about what's top of mind as the criteria or your methodology or problem-solving process. So you ask about problem solving. What are the key dimensions on which you will make the decision? And if you can share that, then that helps people engage. And it also brings transparency. If you have to make a decision that's overriding some of the discussion points, the more transparent you are about the process, then that enables you to make that call.
Okay, that's actually really useful, especially the steering, I think, individual people in advance, especially, the local context one is the one that I was thinking of, just getting people churning on the ideas, especially the people who have a very specific ability on the board that isn't accessible elsewhere.
If you have disagreement in the conversation, like how to deal with that. So you might have an issue where you actually have a hotly contested debate, right? And you want to let that debate run a little bit, like that diversity, that difference of opinion is a good thing. You don't want everybody to just fall into line necessarily because you might be missing something. But you can also say, if a discussion is like not coming to a conclusion, you can say, let's take it offline. Let's do a smaller meeting, or I'll do a one-to-one with you or somebody else, and we'll get to the bottom of this and then we'll make a decision. Yeah. So you can do that as well. So don't be afraid to entertain a spicy conversation, but you also don't have to conclude it in the meeting. You can use different tools to keep the conversation moving forward. You don't want the conversation to get stuck. And that's one of the key skills of a chair, is keeping you to time and also making sure that you don't get stuck.
That's actually another thing I didn't really know. So if it's not really going somewhere, pull that out of the meeting and say, look, this isn't the sort of time to do this now. Let them debate it as much as is productive. And then if it's really at a dead end, then just sort of say, let's have a smaller meeting where the people who are really lasered in on this topic can discuss it more fruitfully.
Exactly.
More time to think about it.
The way I would do that is, and this I think is a great life skill, which is synthesis, right? It's not the same as summary. Summary is like, if you listen to 5 minutes of conversation, you say the main points in 30 seconds. That's summary. Synthesis is summary plus implication, or summary plus, meaning. So let's say that you've had 5 minutes of conversation. So what you would say when you were synthesizing is, okay, so just to bring all of that together, Mary is advocating for this, for these two reasons. And then Susan is advocating for that, for these two reasons. And the implication of that is that, it sounds like what we're trying to do is weigh up the legal concerns with the commercial concerns and make the best decision in an imperfect environment. Yeah. So I think we should take that offline. I'll pick a one-to-one with Mary, or a three-way conversation with Mary and Susan, have that offline, come to a decision, and we'll report back to the rest of the board once we've had that conversation.
Sure. And also another thing that I just thought of, given that the directors are also going to be doing this for the first time, maybe they come and they don't have the information that the board wants to make a decision. Yeah. How do I handle that process? Do I just say, look, we can't have this discussion now because we don't have the data for it, and then we can send out some information later and sort of get an asynchronous answer from all of you? Or
it's a great question. If there's no time pressure, depending on the cadence of your meetings, you could postpone it. Probably you'll take a reflection away from that, which is there was something about the preparation that could have made that meeting successful, but was lacking. So either you didn't prepare people, or you didn't give them the right raw materials to digest so that they can come with a recommendation. Now, if you don't have time to do that, then you could pick one person and say, I'll take this offline with so-and-so one-to-one. Or you could say, I'm going to send you a structured note about this. And if you could all reply to me with your thoughts. What you don't want to do necessarily is create a board meeting through email. It could just kind of get a bit out of hand. If you can do that in a more hub and spoke type model, you send it to people, they reply to you with their thoughts, and then you make a decision.
Okay, that's really useful as well, because I probably would have accidentally done the board meeting by email idea. In terms of, you're chairing the meeting, you're the referee, but do I throw my 10 pence? To what extent do I voice my opinion?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to answer this. One is if you're chairing the meeting as a kind of chief exec character, or if there's a chair. So if there's a chair, a good chair will actually elicit the views of everyone, including yourself, and hold the conversation structure and make sure there's a balance of representation of views. If you're chairing and you're the chief exec, then there's a risk that you do overbear others with your view. And what I would say is, although ultimately you have to make the final decision on most of these questions, you should use the time to get everybody's views. From an opinion point of view, I would speak last or later in the conversation so as not to shape it. But you will be speaking to ask questions. So you might unpack things. So somebody says their views. Okay, tell me more about how strongly do you believe that to be true? Or what are you basing that on? So you're talking, but what you're doing is you're facilitating. You're not necessarily contributing. And then when it comes to contribution, if you're chairing, I would contribute late in the conversation. So it's much more about clarifying questions. It's much more about synthesis, like listening to everyone saying, okay, it sounds like the dominant challenge we're all trying to tackle is this one thing. That's an example of synthesis. You're summarizing and then you're kind of pointing people towards the implication of the conversation.
That's really useful. And also that not to muddy the waters or sort of shape everyone around my actual view. Because people obviously do tend to do that. They agglomerate around the first view or two that they hear. So that's a good idea. And maybe picking people with diverse views early on, just so that the conversation doesn't end all sort of momentum going to one side, because I've picked 3 people who agree with me first, and then the one person I know isn't going maybe necessarily to be as likely to counter that.
Exactly.
And then, in the questions I sent you before about how to decide things, I sort of said very junior common room at university thing to do is just to vote on what everyone thinks. But I wasn't really sure that one man, one vote is an effective way to resolve key strategic issues. I don't think, you can't really weight it for the intensity of people's opinions, or I might not strongly believe anything at all, but I have to vote one way or the other. You think it's more just to have the conversation and then decide?
Yeah, I think certainly having like a purely democratic vote on all things is quite a unsophisticated way of solving nuanced problems. And especially if you've got an even number of people in your board, you're bound to have like deadlocks. So what I would do is, I think a show of hands is good to see where people fall along lines of a discussion, but framing it as such, it's a show of hands. It's not a vote on the final decision. All of this also is shaped by the internal culture of the organization, how decisions are made, people's expectations, but generally assuming that you have the final call as the chief exec or equivalent, it's really important to explain the problem-solving rationale, the problem-solving process. The most important thing to solve for in this decision is speed. Or in your judgment, it's most important to solve for X. If you're making very random decisions, then that approach doesn't work. But if you're making decisions that you want to be able to substantiate and have some method, then that's a really good way to kind of lay that out.
Let's use the example that you used earlier about maybe someone has local knowledge on the ground. So we have one person on the board who's local on the ground, and the rest of the board doesn't have that experience. Even if everyone else on the board thought something different, how strongly I can weigh other people's opinions. Is that a good reason? I don't know the answer, but the one person we have who's got sort of good local knowledge and a history of making good decisions on this front thinks this.
Sometimes companies will have a culture of making decisions in a certain way, like it's embedded in their cultural values. A company may differentiate itself on speed. So they might say, where possible, we will always seek to learn as quickly as possible. We'll always seek to go to market as quickly as possible. Then you might have other companies where one of your values is that you're led by local intelligence, in the case of a social impact organization. So I think that's perfectly fine.
Perfect. Practicing my chairing skills, because I know you don't have long left. The last bit that I want to talk about was sort of what to do after the meeting. So, you've sort of had the meeting, you've had the discussion, you've reached some conclusions, other things you've decided to take offline, where you can have individual discussions, and maybe you have those in the thing we said about the hub and spoke model, and I've got all of these opinions and ideas and so on. Firstly, what sort of follow-up do I do immediately after the meeting? In terms of the directors going forwards, what sort of follow-up do I do with them? And then finally, do you then give sort of interim updates on action points, or do you just wait for the next board meeting to give the whole narrative again, or do you report back to specific people?
Basically, it depends a bit on the organization. So oftentimes startups will have a board, and then they'll have investors or people on a mailing list, people they're trying to warm up to become future investors or existing investors. So they get investor updates monthly, 2 monthly, quarterly. And then there's also a board meeting monthly, 2 monthly, quarterly. In this case, what a reasonable thing to do would be to set your cadence of board meetings and then to do like a short update, for example, in between the board meetings. So let's say you have a board meeting once a quarter, maybe at the midpoint of the quarter, you might do like a written update. And I think that's fine to keep people on board. Again, I would have a standard email structure that you can easily fill in wins, things that are not going that well, key numbers, and asks what you can help us with. Then in terms of after the meeting, so in the meeting itself, there should be a note taker. And one of the great chairs that I worked with, he used to actually dictate some of the notes, like action points or specific notes to go into the minutes. Because the minutes, you don't want them to be like a verbatim account of everything that was discussed. You actually want to take deliberate notes. You want to be clear about what you're noting and why. So he would dictate, he would say, let's take a note that this matter was discussed, concerns were raised about this, a point was raised about that, a question was asked, it will be followed up at the next board meeting, action, CEO to report back at the next meeting on this. So he'll actually dictate the points. So that was a really great example. So once you've got those notes and the actions at the end of the meeting, you want to circulate those. And then I would say to people, give them a few days and say, if you have any comments on these, back to me by end of day Friday. So you can see that a lot of this is like very process driven. It's really important to have that laid out. It's quite difficult to sort of figure it out on the fly. So have a think of it like the whole life cycle of that through, and then you can just sort of follow that either with calendar reminders or whatever it may be. So you send the notes, ask people to get back to you with like amendments or queries by the end of the week. And then in the next meeting where you do have action points from a meeting, you want to actually revisit those on the record, say, these are the action points. You can do it at the beginning of the meeting and say, our answers were sent by email, or the number that we were looking for was this number. So you kind of close those out. And then there's like another final consideration, which is if you have board meetings and you're lucky to have them in person, it's always great to just do something social. So maybe go out for dinner after the meeting if you can. I don't know if anyone or everyone can meet in person, probably not. That's just a nice thing to do.
In terms of once you run a board meeting, what is the process for, say, me and especially the directors for reflecting on how that board meeting went? Should we do it maybe before the next board meeting, or would it be normal to ask the board members, did that go very well at the end of the meeting?
There's two angles to this. One is like you with the management team, and then there's you with the external board members that just come in for the board meetings. So with your management team, as part of your build up to the meeting, you consider like having a call. So consider getting everyone together for like a pre-call a day before, 2 days before, to run through stuff that you need a heads up on ahead of the meeting. And then you can check base with them afterwards. You can either call them one by one, or you can have like a debrief. You can even do the debrief straight after the meeting. Once the external board members have left, you can do like a separate calendar invite and just jump in there and just be like, how did everyone think that went? I think that's a really good idea. The other side of it is like how you get feedback from the external board members. And I think there, what I would say is, a big part of all of this is just managing your relationship with them. It's okay to like actually call them in between meetings, to have like one-to-one calls, and you'll get some feedback there. So you can ask them like, how do you think we're doing? Do you think we're sending good material ahead of time? Do you think we're giving enough time for the key issues? Do you think that everybody is contributing? Do you think I'm leaning in too much with my own views? A lot of the like coaching piece that you get as a executive team member from board members, it happens outside formal board meetings. If you can meet them, great. If not, have a telephone call with them. And that can also go into the expectation setting and the onboarding at the front of the process. Is when you bring people in, you can say one of the critical components of your role is actually to give me feedback, right? I will expect you to give me insightful feedback. I will expect you to challenge me on my execution in the board meetings and with the team, but also on like, am I reflecting the values that we say we're out here to promote, whatever it may be. So that happens outside the board meetings. It happens in one-to-ones. You don't really want like in the actual meeting itself to like bust into like group feedback as a whole. I probably wouldn't do it that way. In summary, meeting with your internal team straight after is like a good thing to do. And then like catching up with the board members one-to-one, also a good thing to do. Like I think thinking about it as before, during, and after is a really good framing. I think the process management is critical, and having a good chair. You could even ask somebody to be a guest chair, right? If you haven't got an actual chair and you want to hand that duty on, so you're able to participate more. So yeah, I think if you do all of that, then you'll quickly also start to learn, because you'll be thinking about what's working well.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's really, really useful. And like you said, it is mainly a process. So the flow improves each iteration of it if you're doing it right.
Exactly.
Yeah, I know you have to leave. So do you have any final thoughts before you go?
The only last thing I would say is that as a company director in the UK, you have some legal obligations which are important, like following the bylaws, promoting the success of the company, exercising independent judgment, avoiding conflicts of interest. There's a list of like 7 of them or so. And that's critical. So we haven't talked about that, but obviously that's an important thing to know what your duties are. And then in the actual delivery of those duties, that's basically obviously the conversation we've just had, like how to make sure that goes well. So if you haven't seen that, it's worth Googling duties of a director. So you're familiar with those, because that is important. And it's the kind of foundation for a lot of this.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure there's lots of information online.
Yeah, and some of this stuff, like you won't get this on the .gov.uk websites. It's just like watching people that are good chairs, good operators, like seeing how they manage it. So that's where a lot of this is being shared from. And yeah, hopefully it's useful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.